When two remarkably similar Northern Virginia women are murdered just months apart in nearly identical crimes, their neighbors fear that a serial offender is at large. DNA evidence proves them right, and investigators strive to identify a serial killer who preys on the elderly in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Marion Marshall was last seen alive on August 14th, 2006. She was 72 years old and lived in Springfield, Virginia. Springfield is a census-designated area in Fairfax County, just southwest of D.C. The vibe is middle-class suburban, the population is diverse, and the violent crime rate is significantly lower than the Virginia average. With its abundant parks, quality schools, and proximity to the capital, it's an especially attractive area for families. Marion had lived in Northern Virginia for most of her adult life. She was originally from Illinois, but for decades she'd worked as a librarian in D.C. and its suburbs. By 2006, she had retired, but she hadn't slowed down. Instead, she'd become heavily involved in local volunteerism. In addition to other charitable pursuits, she generously donated time to teaching English as a second language. And there was ample demand for this since Springfield has a sizable immigrant population. According to 2006 census data, about a third of the area's households spoke a language other than English at home, and of those households, half had limited English proficiency. So, Marion's services were very useful and much appreciated in her community. Unsurprisingly, considering her long career as a librarian, Marion also loved to read and was an active member of multiple local book clubs. And on top of that, she was also a congregant at a local church. So, although she was retired, she was a busy person and very involved in her community. August 14th began as an ordinary day for Marion. She had errands to run, mainly grocery shopping, and later in the day she had plans to meet up with a friend. Late that morning, she went to the Bradlick Shopping Center in nearby Annandale, where she shopped at the giant grocery store. She left the store at around 11:15 a.m. We know thanks to the store's security footage.
I'm guessing, just because I'm not really familiar with them, Giant is the name of the store, and it's not just like a big store.
The stores are average in size, but yes, Giant, that's the name of the store, just like Kroger or Publix. Giant is the name. I spent many a shopping trip there with my mom as a little kid. So after that, she returned to her home with her groceries. When she arrived at her modest, ranch-style red brick home, before she could even put the food she'd purchased away, someone attacked her. A friend of Marion's, the one she'd been planning to meet, realized that something was wrong just a few hours later. They'd planned to meet up that afternoon, but Marion hadn't shown, which wasn't like her at all. Marion knew how to manage her time and commitments. She had to in order to maintain her busy schedule. So her friend summoned a taxi and had the driver take her to Marion's house, which was located on the 6600 block of Bostwick Drive. When she arrived, she saw that Marion's car was parked at her house. Fearing that something might be wrong, she didn't feel comfortable going into Marion's home on her own, so she knocked on the door of one of Marion's next-door neighbors, explained the situation, and asked him to come with her to check on Marion. That neighbor, a man named Harold, agreed. Marion's friend had a key to her home, so they were able to unlock the door and enter without issue. When they were inside, their worst fears were confirmed. Marion was lying on the floor of her living room, and it was clear that she was deceased. Some of her groceries, a loaf of bread, and other items were scattered nearby on the floor. Others sat on the counter. At first, Marion's friend and neighbor assumed that she died of natural causes. They knew she had a cardiac condition and thought that perhaps that had been the cause of her death. Harold would later tell journalist James Cullum, quote, "She had facial bruising and bruising on her arms. She had a heart condition, so at first I thought she'd had a heart attack and got bruised when she fell. Some of her groceries were still on the kitchen table when we walked in the house. It was like she got home and put the groceries down and there was a knock at the door. It was like he was waiting for her. End quote.
Okay, so obviously that quote comes after he finds out.
Yes, that it wasn't natural causes.
But the natural causes thing makes sense. I'm wondering, did her friend and Harold know each other before? Like, did she know that that was somebody that she could go into, or did she just happen to pick a neighbor?
I really don't know.
When it comes to Harold's theory that she heard a knock at the door, my first thought was that somebody might have followed her in, used the point where she was distracted coming home with groceries as if they'd been observing her house or they were familiar with her routine.
That's one possibility, yeah.
But the fact that she has the groceries on the table, it does make me think that she probably opened the door for somebody. Even if she didn't know who that person was, I mean, she's in her 70s. It wouldn't be hard for somebody to quickly overpower her and force their way in and close the door behind them.
Right. So she also actually had a history of joint problems, which had led her to have double knee replacements. So she was not physically strong, and the idea of her suffering from a cardiac event or a fall wasn't far-fetched to those who knew her. So when they entered the home, that's why at first they thought, maybe it had been natural causes. But Marion had, unfortunately, as Harold's quote foreshadowed, not died from natural causes. The bruises on her face and arms were the result of a beating, not a fall. According to a press release issued by the Fairfax County Police, the medical examiner who performed her autopsy determined that the cause of her death had been strangulation and blunt force trauma. Her manner of death was homicide.
Strangulation, that's always telling for more than average violence to me.
Yes, it is. Not only was she fatally strangled, she was badly beaten. So this was pretty over-the-top violence, especially for, a victim who's rather frail compared to the average person.
It seems like an unnecessary amount of violence.
Yes, it is. And it's overkill, and we will be discussing that continually throughout this episode. Now, when it came to who might have wanted to brutally murder a 72-year-old retired librarian who devoted most of her time and energy to charity, investigators were at a loss, just like Marion's family, friends, and neighbors were. Marion was a single woman who lived alone and had never had children, so there was no spouse or significant other to look into, and no kids who might have been overeager for a potential inheritance. She did have some extended family, but again, she wasn't from anywhere near Northern Virginia originally, and to the best of my knowledge, she didn't even have relatives in the area.
Yeah, it's hard to find an immediate suspect there. If I was investigating this, it would be very hard to narrow down a suspect pool. My first places I would look would be from her social circle, like church, the charities, someone that she was loosely associated with that she might have upset.
Absolutely, that's something that investigators would, and I'm sure did, look into. Now, at the crime scene, there were no signs of a break-in, which suggests several possibilities. One is that Marion might have opened the door for her killer and let them in, like you suggested, Scott. Another is that they might have followed her through the open door when she'd brought in her groceries, surprising her and forcing their way in. And another is that they may have found their way into her home, potentially through an unlocked door or window, while she'd been running errands, and they may have waited for her to return. And as for her killer's motivation, nothing appeared to be missing or ransacked inside the home, so it hadn't been a robbery. It ended up being the medical examiner who revealed the killer's motivation when they determined that Marion had been sexually assaulted by her attacker. Sexually motivated homicides of elderly victims are rare, but that's exactly what had occurred. Needless to say, other residents in Marion's neighborhood, which was typically a quiet neighborhood, were shaken by her murder. In particular, Harold, the neighbor who'd gone into her home with her friend and had discovered her body, was disturbed. His own elderly mom lived with him in his home right next door to Marion's. His mom and Marion were even friends. He himself hadn't been home earlier that day at the presumed time of the murder, which meant that his mom had been home alone, unknowingly just a few yards or meters away from where her friend was being fatally attacked.
That's definitely enough to shake him to his core.
Absolutely. He wondered what if the killer had chosen his house and his mom instead. The thought haunted him to the extent that he purchased a handgun and began carrying it concealed on his person, fearful that the killer would return to the neighborhood. Other neighbors became ultra adamant about locking their doors, checking and rechecking that they'd done so. Some even became reluctant to leave their homes if it wasn't absolutely necessary. And it would turn out that they were right to be cautious because the killer was still out there and he would strike again. A quote that Harold gave to Patch.com after his neighbor's murder would, in a few months, become especially poignant. He told journalist James Cullum, quote, "I really want the cops to catch this guy, but I feel like the only way it's going to happen is if he commits another crime and they match his DNA." End quote.
So obviously the fear of a serial killer was running rampant, and apparently they were correct to believe that?
Yes, they were. And like I said, the killer struck again, but the way in which it happened, the details of the second offense, would shock everyone in their specificity. When the killer struck again, residents and law enforcement in Fairfax County would experience a baffling sense of déjà vu. It was Marion's murder all over again, even down to the name. More on that next. And now, back to Marion and Marion's story. When 72-year-old Marion Marshall was assaulted and murdered in her Fairfax County home, fear spread through her suburban neighborhood. Residents were afraid that the killer would strike again, and he did. But few, if any, people had predicted how incredibly similar his second crime would be to the first. Marion Newman was last seen alive on November 21st, 2006, so approximately 3 months after Marion Marshall had been killed. Marion Newman was 74 years old, and, like Marion Marshall, she lived in a quiet Springfield neighborhood. Also like Marion Marshall, she was retired, unmarried, child-free, and devoted the majority of her time to volunteerism. In particular, she volunteered at local animal shelters. She absolutely loved animals, especially dogs, and at her church.
Okay, so charities and volunteer work and the church, that's all similar.
Uh-huh.
I know investigators looked into them. I'm just wondering if they knew each other from any of those.
They did not. It was different volunteer groups and different churches. They were not acquainted with one another.
Oh, that's really interesting then. Aside from their similarities, it's almost like they chose their victim off of their age and name.
It does kind of seem like that. These two women are so similar. It's like they're living these parallel lives, in the same suburb, and yet they don't know each other. Now, Marion Newman was also devoted to her elderly mom, who, at age 92, lived in a local retirement community. Marion visited her mom every single day. They always ate dinner and spent several hours together in the evenings, and a neighbor of Marion's would later tell journalists that Marion and her mom were inseparable best friends. Marion never even took vacations or went out of town. She was literally always there for her mom from 3:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. She also called her mom every single morning, ensuring that she never had to experience the loneliness that some residents of assisted living facilities do. So when Marion failed to show up for dinner with her mom on November 20th, her mom was worried. She waited, but Marion never showed up, and the next morning she didn't call either. So when she couldn't get a hold of her daughter, she called her daughter's next-door neighbor, a woman named Reba. Now, Marion's mom didn't actually call her Marion. She called her by her nickname for her, Sweetie. So she called Reba and asked her whether she'd seen Sweetie that day. Reba had not. She told Marion's mom that she hadn't seen her, but that her car was sitting in her driveway. And Marion's mom was even more worried. Her daughter, her Sweetie, never deviated from their routine. So she called a male neighbor of her daughter's and asked him to go over to her daughter's home and check on her.
Yeah, so when you think about her being 92 and the lack of mobility or ability to go check on her herself, that must feel like an incredibly helpless situation.
Yeah, but fortunately, Marion, just like the other Marion, they had good relationships with their neighbors, so her mom was able to reach out to them and have them go and check on her. The neighbor, of course, he agreed, and when he walked over to Marion's red brick ranch-style home, which was located on the 7100 block of Reservoir Road, he found the front door cracked open. Not only that, but her keys were hanging from the lock on the interior side of the door. He entered the home, searching for any sign of Marion. He found her in her bedroom, clearly deceased, and he immediately contacted police.
One thing to point out here is she had that very stringent routine. So if somebody
Yes, she did.
was watching her, they'd know exactly what that routine looked like.
Yeah, it wouldn't be difficult every day, same routine in the evenings. Now, when investigators from the Fairfax County Police Department arrived at Marion Newman's home, it was much like when investigators had arrived at Marion Marshall's home 3 months prior. The houses were located just 2 miles, or slightly over 3 kilometers, from each other, and they even looked alike. Both were ranch-style homes built from red brick. Inside, they found Marion Newman lying in her bedroom, deceased, just as her neighbor had reported. There was obvious bruising on her neck. The medical examiner who performed her autopsy would determine that, just as with Marion Marshall, her cause of death had been strangulation and blunt force trauma to her upper body, and her manner of death had been homicide. Also, like the other Marion, she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators would come to theorize that she had likely been ambushed at her front door when she'd returned home from the last dinner she'd had with her mom. She'd been carrying a container of leftovers at the time. As with her counterpart 3 months before, Marion Newman was unmarried, lived alone, with the exception of her beloved small dogs, and had no children. On the subject of Marion's dogs, for the record, none of the reporting on this case mentions what happened to them, so I assumed that they were okay and weren't stolen or anything like that.
With small dogs, they're easier to manage or hide if you're doing something nefarious than a larger dog would be.
Sure, her dogs that she kept were miniature Doberman pinschers, so really cute little things, not a dog that could defend you from a killer.
The optimist in me wants to say that they're fine.
I think they are, because the reports didn't say. Now, in any case, investigators asked her next-door neighbor, Reba, to walk through her home with them and tell them whether anything had been taken. Reba knew Marion well enough to assist with this. They were friends as well as neighbors, so she agreed. But the only thing that was missing was a diamond ring that Marion liked to wear. Reba couldn't point out anything else in the home that was gone. Now, to the best of my knowledge, it's never been determined whether Marion's killer took her ring, but the ring has never been located, so the odds that he did seem pretty fair. If he did take her ring, it may have been as a souvenir of the crime. We've got a picture of the ring, which was custom made up on our website. It's unique, so please take a look and see whether you recognize it.
Yeah, it sounds like something that would be an easy trophy to take, and makes me wonder if investigators might have missed a ring that Marion Marshall might have been missing.
Now, I don't know if Marion Marshall was in the habit of wearing jewelry. I suppose it's possible.
And even if she didn't wear it, she might have still had it. And I mean, I wouldn't expect neighbors to really know every piece of jewelry someone does or doesn't have.
Sure. I think that if he took the ring as a trophy, it was an act of opportunity. He saw the ring, it was right there, so why not? He might not necessarily have taken a trophy from Marion Marshall. Now, in any case, at first, investigators had no direct, concrete evidence that the two murders were related. There was, of course, a wealth of obvious similarities. The crimes were similar, bordering on identical, as were the victims. Not only did the two victims share the same first name, they also lived within just 2 miles of each other in the same suburb, lived in very similar homes and very similar neighborhoods, were approximately the same age, led similar lifestyles as single, child-free retirees who devoted their time to volunteerism, and they even looked similar. Scott, I'm going to show you photos of the two Marions so you can see how similar in appearance they were. They had really similar styles, right down to their haircuts and choice of eyewear. For anyone listening who'd like to see these photos, they're on our website. The link is in the show notes.
I am honestly very surprised at how similar they look.
Right? They both got that short haircut, the gray hair that you would associate with an older woman in the 2000s. They've got those thick plastic-framed glasses. They're both wearing like a deep shade of pink lipstick. And they've even both got these light in color patterned tops on in these photos. If you told me that these women were sisters, I would believe it.
Yeah, like their complexion and how they've aged looks incredibly similar.
Right.
And I'm guessing the one on the left, for me looking at it, is Marion Marshall.
That's Marion Newman, actually.
Okay. Marion Newman, she honestly looks a lot like my grandma.
She looks a lot like my great-grandmother. Right. For people our age, millennials, picture stereotypical grandmother, white, middle-class, older woman, and that's what these ladies looked like.
Golden Girls era.
Yeah. As you can imagine, Marion Newman's death caused a new wave of fear in the community, just as Marion Marshall's had a few months before. Her neighbor, Reba, told journalist James Collum, quote, "Before she passed away, you could go to bed with the door open. I don't trust people after dark, so I don't go out to the car at night," end quote. Immediately after Marion Newman's murder, officers from the Fairfax County Police Department gave a press conference. One officer, Major Sean Barrett, who commanded the department's Major Crimes Bureau, stated that, quote, "There's a tremendous amount of similarities between the two cases. It's almost eerie," end quote.
I agree.
I would say it's very eerie. Still, in those early days of the investigation, investigators didn't know for sure whether the two murders had been committed by the same offender. It would take forensic analysis of DNA evidence left at the crime scenes in order to determine that. And when that analysis was performed, it confirmed what the public and investigators had suspected all along. The same offender had murdered both Marion Marshall and Marion Newman. Scott, you probably won't be surprised, given that this is a Northern Virginia case, to learn that investigators consulted Parabon Labs.
Absolutely not. I mean, obviously, from what we know about them, they've been featured in a number of our episodes, and they are top tier when it comes to this.
Definitely. As we've discussed in those other episodes, Parabon Nanolabs is a really cool company that performs advanced DNA analysis, specifically genetic genealogy, phenotyping, ancestry, and kinship analysis. They're located right in Fairfax County where these murders occurred. And according to their website, since 2018, they've identified more than 365 persons of interest via their Snapshot genetic genealogy service. So their services are very helpful to law enforcement.
We hear about breakthroughs that happen because of genealogical DNA coming all the time.
Yeah, super interesting field.
Generally, the ones that you hear about the most come from old cold cases, so it's not surprising to me that they would be consulted in this case.
No, not at all. So, of course, Fairfax County Police, they reached out to them in order to have one of those snapshots made for the suspect in the murders of Marion Marshall and Marion Newman. And the results of that snapshot revealed that the suspect had been a Hispanic male. They used his DNA to create example images of what he might look like, hence the term snapshot. And we've got those images up on our website. Please take a look. The link is in the show notes. Since DNA doesn't reveal a person's age, we don't know how old the suspect was in 2006 at the time of the murders. So there are 3 images showing what he might have looked like at 3 different ages: 25, 40, and 55 years old. Although we can't know for sure, at the time of these murders, the suspect may have looked most similar to the 25-year-old image. I say this because when the victim of a sexually motivated homicide is elderly, the suspect is often, but not always, a young, inexperienced male in their teens or 20s. These young suspects choose older victims because they lack the confidence to target younger, stronger victims. They're looking for unusually vulnerable victims because they're not sure they can handle anything else.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure you've looked into this. I didn't even bother asking about it because I was just waiting for you to bring that up.
Yes. So when they do attack, they often do so blitz style, surprising their victims with more violence than is necessary to overpower them. Overkill is the norm with these types of killings.
So it's just falling more and more in line with what we know about the murders.
Yes, it is. Like I said, sexually motivated homicides of elderly victims are rare, but these ones did occur and they fall very much in line with what we typically see with these kind of crimes. Now, alternatively, killers who target elderly victims in sexually motivated assaults may be older in age and simply immature in terms of personal development. For example, the killer might be a male in his 30s or 40s who, despite his age, hasn't accomplished much in life. He might be unemployed or underemployed with an unstable lifestyle, including difficulty maintaining jobs and relationships. In short, the offenders who commit these kinds of murders are generally, in layman's terms, losers who intentionally seek out incredibly vulnerable victims and overwhelm them with frantic bursts of overwhelming violence.
It sounds like people that would stand out. You wouldn't be surprised to find out that they've committed these attacks.
Yeah, these are not like these suave, intelligent criminals who lead sort of a double life and are, stable, happy family guy, and then they have this dark side. This is not a Jekyll and Hyde thing. This is somebody who's unstable and immature. Now, As I mentioned earlier, sexually motivated homicides of elderly victims don't happen often. However, it's easy to understand, objectively at least, that when they do occur, it's often because the offender lacks criminal prowess and confidence and again is looking for a particularly vulnerable victim. So it's very likely that Marion Marshall and Marion Newman's killer selected them specifically because of their age-related vulnerabilities. However, in this case, we're left to wonder about something more. These two incredibly similar killings of two incredibly similar victims beg the question: did the killer intentionally target two victims who shared a name along with so many other similarities? After all, Marion was not a particularly popular name for baby girls born during the 1930s. It ranked at just number 88 in popularity for that decade. So, was this all an unlikely coincidence or something more? Right off the bat, I will say, I do not think that there was any sort of mistaken identity going on here. And by that, I mean, I don't think that the killer specifically set out to kill a specific woman named Marion and accidentally killed the wrong one on his first try. Now, I say this because all evidence points to the killings being sexually motivated with little in the way of planning or organization. The killer attacked in a blitz style, which is associated with disorganized offenders. Additionally, the killer seems, to the best of public knowledge anyway, to have committed the brutal murders with his hands rather than bringing a weapon along. If he did use any sort of weapon during the beatings, it may have been a weapon of opportunity rather than what we typically think of when we hear the word weapon, like a gun or a knife. There was nothing like that.
Yeah, the strangulation really points towards it being very hands-on and sloppy. And another point here is that he didn't even make sure the door was closed on his way out with Marion Newman.
Yeah, so everything points to very limited planning, if any, went into the crimes. And of course, the killer left his DNA behind at both crime scenes, making no effort, so far as we know, to clean it up or eliminate evidence. All of this suggests a disorganized offender, likely someone who was young or simply immature for their age, with average or below average intelligence. In short, we are not dealing with a criminal mastermind here, nor are we dealing with some kind of career criminal carrying out a hit for hire. Rather, we're likely dealing with someone who's impulsive, easily overwhelmed by emotion, sloppy, and likely an underachiever in life and relationships. We're dealing, I suspect, with an offender who isn't particularly intelligent or meticulous by any means, but has simply gotten lucky when it comes to not being caught.
Yeah, the real thing that stands out here is that we don't have a larger victim pool. Like, we have two very similar victims, which makes me wonder if the killer might have gained confidence after killing Marion Newman and changed his age range to slightly younger.
I mean, anything's possible, but, we don't know. In this case, we just don't know. Now, naturally, investigators compared the killer's DNA to the many, many DNA profiles in the FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS. As we've discussed in many past episodes, most of the time, when someone is arrested on a felony charge in the U.S., a sample of their DNA is collected and added to the CODIS database. So there are millions of profiles in there that investigators can compare suspects' DNA against in order to try to identify the donor. However, when investigators added this killer's DNA into CODIS, there was no match. This means that the killer has probably never been arrested anywhere in the U.S. for a felony-level charge.
Yeah, it's not to say he hasn't been arrested for a misdemeanor or committed other lesser crimes.
Yeah, sure, but they wouldn't take your DNA for a misdemeanor, typically. What we know about the offender really boils down to this. He was a disorganized offender, and he was of Hispanic origin. Now, his ethnicity doesn't narrow the field down much since a large portion of Fairfax County's population is Hispanic. The area where these crimes occurred is far from homogeneous. The population is diverse, with the capital area and the opportunities it offers attracting people from all over the country and even the world. Marion Marshall was one such domestic transplant, having moved from the Midwest to build her life and career in the D.C. area. Many residents of Fairfax County have moved from even farther away to establish their lives in the area. And we also don't know whether the offender is a lifelong American or perhaps someone who had previously lived in another country. Fairfax County has a significant population of foreign-born citizens, and If the offender has ties to another country, that could perhaps explain how such an impulsive and violent individual has gone 19 years without being arrested for any felony crimes within the U.S. Perhaps he returned. Other countries, of course, do not collect their arrestees' DNA to contribute to a U.S. database. So if this offender has moved to another country and continued committing serious crimes there, we just wouldn't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I find it incredibly odd that they would just stop after 2 successful murders.
I do too. This is a person who's going to commit more crimes. Even if it's not more murders, they are going to offend. This is going to be a person with a criminal history.
My main thought is likely going to be somebody that's either been incarcerated for a number of years on misdemeanor charges or been in and out of jail for it.
You wouldn't be incarcerated for years at a time for misdemeanor charges, but you could have like an in and out of jail sort of thing.
Yeah, that's my thought.
Who's to say? And of course, people die. We don't even have a way of knowing if the offender is still alive. And then again, with the foreign country thing, it's possible that this offender is and always has been in the U.S. and has just simply managed to scrape by under law enforcement's radar somehow. And when it comes to this offender's place of residence, I think it's worth pointing out that statistically speaking, disorganized offenders often commit their crimes close to home. So, in 2006, at the time of these murders, the killer likely lived in the same suburb as his victims, Marion Marshall and Marion Newman. And if he didn't live there, he may have worked there if he was employed at the time.
Yeah, I really suspect he was somebody that was in the area frequently enough to watch them coming and going, not for long. He doesn't have that kind of restraint or self-control,
right?
But just enough to be able to observe their pattern enough to know when they'd be moving in and out.
Yeah, so how exactly he selected his victims is unknown. Now, the victims' houses were in the same suburb, but they were located about 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers apart from each other, so a bit of a distance when it comes to walking anyway. So maybe the offender had access to some kind of vehicle, like a car, moped, bicycle, anything really, that he may have used to travel between neighborhoods and cruise around, maybe looking for opportunities to victimize someone.
One of the things that stands out to me is somebody that could have been going through these suburbs doing some sort of business like lawn care, something along those lines.
Door-to-door sales, utility work. So, maybe he had a job that took him around local neighborhoods. Marion Marshall's murder occurred midday on an August Friday, probably close to noon. And Marion Newman's murder occurred on a November evening. These times could perhaps be within someone's working hours. They weren't happening in the middle of the night. This is someone who was cruising around the neighborhood or at least present in the neighborhood during the day/evening. And as morbid of a thought as it is, the methods of killing that the offender used did not, so far as I'm aware, produce a significant amount of blood evidence, if any. Reporting on these cases described the victims' bodies as being bruised, but not bloody. So it's perhaps possible that he could have committed these murders and then gone on through the neighborhood looking relatively the same as he had before the crimes.
Yeah, that would make me think that he's not part of like a work crew where somebody would notice he was missing or gone for an extended period of time.
Right, I get what you're saying. If he committed these offenses while working in the area, you're right, his coworkers would notice. So presumably he was alone when he did these things.
Unless he came back after and he had selected them while he was working.
That's possible too. A lot of what ifs in this case, a lot of information gaps. During the course of my research for this episode, I searched news archives for articles on any other similar crimes in the area. And one stood out to me. A 2009 article about a 79-year-old victim who was beaten and sexually assaulted in her Woodbridge, Virginia home. Woodbridge is only an 11-mile, or a little under 18-kilometer drive south of Springfield. Fortunately, the victim in the 2009 attack survived thanks to very quick intervention by police. She had been on the phone with a relative when her attacker had struck, and her relative had called police who responded quickly. When they arrived on scene, the offender stopped the violent attack and fled the scene on foot. The victim was taken to the hospital where she received treatment for her injuries. Afterward, people in her community banded together to make repairs and improvements to her house to make it more secure. And that's what the newspaper article I first read was about, the repair efforts. But I wondered, by 2009, could Marion Marshall and Marion Newman's killer have moved south to Woodbridge? I quickly learned that no, that had not been the case. Other news articles on the attack were available, and I learned that the woman's attacker, a man named Andy Ralston, was caught just a few days after the assault. And it was immediately obvious that he was not the offender who had killed Marion Marshall and Marion Newman. He couldn't be because he was a non-Hispanic white male. Now, in any case, he did go on to be convicted of the crimes he committed in the attack against his 79-year-old victim, and he remains incarcerated at the time of this recording, for the record.
Toodaloo.
Ralston's brutal crime demonstrates that although sexually motivated attacks on elderly victims are rare, unfortunately, they are not rare enough. The attack that Ralston perpetrated was similar in many ways to Marion Marshall and Marion Newman's cases. He knocked on the victim's door, forced his way in when she answered, and then began beating and sexually assaulting her in a blitz-style attack. Had officers not intervened, it's very possible, likely even, that her case would have been a homicide. And yet, despite these remarkable similarities and the fact that this crime occurred just miles from Springfield, it was unrelated to the other two cases.
Yeah, that's pretty surprising.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that at the time of the crime, Ralston was 48 years old, not an adolescent by any stretch of the imagination. However, he did fit the typical profile of a disorganized violent offender. He was of low social status with an unstable lifestyle. At the time of the attack, he had no fixed address. He had a troubled history of run-ins with the law and was often in and out of jail. In addition to violent and property crimes, his history included many alcohol-related offenses. He was what the state of Virginia refers to as a habitual offender, which is someone whose license has been revoked due to repeated incidents of driving while intoxicated. In short, Ralston was someone who committed lots of crimes and was not smart enough to get away with them. He was what most might call simply a big loser.
I mean, he fits the loser profile.
Now, although he certainly is a loser, he is not the killer investigators are looking for in relation to the murders of Marion Marshall and Marion Newman. Their killer is someone else, and he remains unidentified and possibly still at large.
In a series of coincidences, this is just a coincidental local loser to the others.
Yeah, and that's why I decided to include this case in the episode just to emphasize an important fact when it comes to investigations, which is that coincidences actually happen all the time. I can tell you that from my own work, and here's an easy example.
As you know, I'm somebody that generally says I don't believe in coincidence, but to me, that means that I have a duty to prove that something isn't a coincidence beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
If I can't do that, then there's always that possibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm on the other side of the fence. As I like to say, I absolutely believe in coincidences, especially when it comes to criminal investigations, just because I see them so often. Now, yes, the near-fatal attack on this 79-year-old victim was virtually identical to those perpetrated against Marion Marshall and Marion Newman, and it occurred just miles away and just a couple years afterward. But as it turns out, it was not related in any way to their cases. So, do I think that Marion Marshall and Marion Newman sharing the same name may have been just a coincidence rather than an intentional targeting criteria selected by their shared killer? Yeah, I think it's really possible. Now, when it comes to finally identifying the man who took Marion Newman and Marion Marshall's lives, investigators are seeking assistance from the public. They've asked people who lived in Springfield, particularly the Crestwood and Edsel Park neighborhoods at the time, to think back to 2006 and consider whether they may have noticed anything that may seem potentially relevant in retrospect. In an interview with journalist Lindsay Watts, Fairfax County Police Detective Christopher Flanagan said, quote, "It may not have seemed unusual at the time. It could have been someone offering to bring in your groceries or offering to help you get into the house." End quote. And by the way, offering to help carry in groceries is exactly how investigators suspect that the killer may have approached Marion Marshall shortly before attacking her. On this note, it's important, I think, to remember that Marion and Marion's killer was a disorganized one. He may have made multiple attempts to target victims, perhaps showing up on other potential victims' doorsteps, only to abandon ship when he realized that they weren't alone in their homes. An offender like this is unlikely to attack unless he believes that he has a particularly vulnerable victim in a particularly vulnerable and isolated situation. So again, if you lived in this area around that time and you have any memories of someone, coming to your door or offering to help you carry things, anything you think is relevant, please reach out to the Fairfax County Police. In life, Marion Marshall and Marion Newman made significant impacts on their community. This meant that in turn, their deaths had significant impacts on their community. Their losses were felt in the organizations they volunteered for, teaching others a new language, aiding the less fortunate, and caring for shelter animals. The clubs, the congregations, and, of course, the families they belonged to were devastated. Marion Newman's 92-year-old mom lost her daughter, her sweetie, as she called her, who had also been her best friend. It was unthinkable, and she herself died just a few months later, presumably still in shock and with no answers. Despite the fact that investigators initially received an outpouring of tips in relation to these cases, none of them resulted in answers and the cases went cold. Still, investigators are seeking new tips to pursue in hopes that they can finally solve this case. Until then, this offender may still be alive and free, and as long as that's true, they pose a potential danger to society's most vulnerable members. If you have any information on the murders of Marion Marshall or Marion Newman, please contact the Fairfax County Police Major Crimes Bureau at 703-246-7800 and select option 8. Or, if you prefer to remain anonymous, contact the Fairfax County Crime Solvers. Info on how to submit a tip is available on their website, fairfaxcrimesolvers.org. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved double homicide of Barbara and William Singer. Their case is not related to Marion Marshall or Marion Newman's, but they were elderly victims who were cruelly attacked in their own home and whose case remains unsolved. We aired our episode on their double homicide in May of 2025. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok and YouTube at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Marion and Marion's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store, which is up and running with new designs after a hiatus. It's where you can get all kinds of LSA goodies like t-shirts, hoodies, and coffee mugs. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Live is Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering, editing, and hot takes are provided by me, Scott.